After defeating Spain in 1898, the U.S. occupied then took control of Cuba through the Platt Amendment, which allowed American troops to enter at will and gave U.S. corporations control over Cuba's economy. By the 1950s, 70 to 80% of Cuba's major industries were American owned, with profits flowing to foreign investors while Cuban workers remained poor. The U.S. supported dictator Batista to protect these corporate interests. This was classic neocolonialism. Cuba was technically independent, but economically controlled and exploited by a foreign power. Fidel Castro overthrew Batista in 1959, ending decades of U.S. economic control over Cuba. The U.S. quickly tried to remove Castro but failed. The U.S. imposed an embargo banning most trade with the country, also restricting financial access and pressuring other countries to limit economic relations. Over time, sanctions expanded to include shipping restrictions, banking limitations, and penalties for any foreign companies that traded with Cuba. This dramatically constrained the country's economy. Since then, Cuba has remained under communist rule and has continued to face severe economic challenges due to the ongoing U.S. embargo and international isolation. Despite these hardships, Cuba kept healthcare free and achieved very high literacy rates. However, the country's economy has struggled because it can't trade freely with other nations and relies heavily on money from tourists and Cubans living abroad. In recent years, Cuba has implemented gradual economic reforms while maintaining its political system, and the U.S. has periodically adjusted its sanctions policy, including a brief thaw under President Obama, followed by renewed restrictions. To ask the average citizen, there isn't much knowledge about what happened with Cuba, but you'll likely hear that Cuba's a communist country and that's why they're poor and unstable. But Cuba's communist system developed under sustained external pressure and complete isolation imposed largely by the United States, making it difficult to evaluate how the system might have performed under normal conditions. By understanding this history, we challenge oversimplified narratives. Here's how the three pillars of whiteness present themselves with how we continue to look at Cuba. U.S. capitalism and governance are seen as the quote-unquote correct models, so Cuba's political and economic choices are framed not as sovereign self-determination, but as deviation. The U.S. acted on the belief that it had the authority to shape Cuba's political outcome. The actions taken against Cuba without question, and how we've looked at and treated Cuba since, reflects the assumption that the U.S. has the right to enforce dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Finally, U.S. political rhetoric frames Cuba as a threat to our way of life, presenting U.S. actions as defensive responses rather than domination, continuing the tradition of colonialism right under our very noses.